The talk actually will be in two parts. The first part will be technical. So I'm just going to report on some technical results. And the second part will be philosophical. I'm going to talk about the philosophical implications of that technical work. Both the technical and the philosophical parts of the paper concern this notion of exact equivalence. That is, and by exact equivalence here, I always mean exact logical equivalence. So we have some semantics, Truthmaker, some notion of a model for Truthmaker Semantics. This gives us a notion of exact equivalence in a model. That is, when two formulas have the same truth makers, and we might also want to have the same falsity makers in a model. And then the logical notion of exact equivalence is simply that in every model of the desired sort, the truth makers and possibly the falsity makers are the same. Okay. So it's, as you're all aware, one does need to distinguish between what you might call positive equivalence, which is just equivalence in regard to the positive content of the formula, and full equivalence, which is equivalence in regard both to the positive and the negative content. So that distinction between the two notions will be important in what follows. When I just talk about equivalence, I would just mean positive equivalence. So I'll be explicit when I have a full equivalence in mind. Now, I should say a little bit by way of motivation. People have put the notion of exact equivalence to use in various ways. Okay. One way, and I'm actually interested in three uses to which it has been put. Okay. One is to the notion of analytic implication. That is the idea that one proposition is part of another. So a paradigm case of that is a conjunct being part of a conjunction. And it's thought that, as a general rule, we don't have that P or Q as a part of P. Okay. So one use that has been made of the notion of exact equivalence, whether it's full or not actually, is to the notion of partial content called analytic implication or entailment. It's called various things. Okay. That's one use. The two other uses concern closure properties. I'm going to talk about logical closure of knowledge, but similar things hold for other propositional attitudes, saying, believing, or what have you. I'll just do it in terms of knowledge. It's thought that there are circumstances in which we do not want to say that knowledge is closed under arbitrary logical consequence. And as Mark pointed out, there are actually two quite different reasons why you might think that knowledge isn't closed under logical. This is classical logical consequence. One has to do with our inferential limitations. We're not able to carry out the enormously long and time and space-consuming effort, resource, and expend the enormous time and enormous resources in time and space that would be required to carry through all the inferences that would be required to actually infer one thing from another. So because of our own inferential limitations, we might think that knowledge is not closed under arbitrary logical consequence. There's another kind of case which is very different, has nothing to, and this is something that Mark pointed out. There's another kind of case that has nothing to do with our inferential limitations. It has to do with the concept of knowledge itself. It might be thought that the concept of knowledge is such that even if we're capable of making the inferences, even if we go through the inferences, still knowledge is not preserved. So classic example is I know that I have hands. I know that if I have hands, I'm not a brain in the bat. So it looks as if I can infer that I'm not a brain in the bat, but it's thought, even if I go through these inferences, don't for one moment think that I know that I'm not a brain in a vat. Okay, and there are many other examples, perhaps more convincing than that one, of this sort of phenomenon. So here, the failure of knowledge to be closed under logical consequence isn't the result of our inferential limitations. It has something to do with the very concept of knowledge itself. Okay. Now, it's thought that the concept of exact equivalence can help us diagnose why our knowledge may not be closed. In both of these, so although these cases both have a different source, I think it's sometimes been thought that the resources of Truthmaker Semantics, and in particular this notion of exact equivalence, could be used to help us understand why there should be these failures of closure. Okay. And I'm not saying a brave soul might say they give a full explanation, but at least they give a partial explanation in this sense, that the notion of containment or analytic entailment at least gives us a lower bound on what we can infer. Okay. So yes, okay, it's not arbitrarily closed, but at least it's closed under analytic implication. At least, okay. So if these are cases in which we go beyond the bounds of analytic implication, where we don't actually have something that's analytic implied, then that gives us reasons to be suspicious of the cases. Of course, we can, in many cases, go beyond those bounds, the bounds of analytic implication, but at least if we don't stay within them, then we have some reason to be suspicious. What I would be arguing is the notion of analytic implication, or even the notion of exact equivalence, fails miserably in these tasks. Okay, maybe a little bit of success here and there, but basically a failure. Okay. Now, and I should also have mentioned that here I was talking about even the lower bound that's set by saying we could only, perhaps the idea that we at least know the analytic implications. But actually, the results I have will show that even if we insist upon exact equivalence, which is a special case of containment, even if we just talk about inferring exact equivalence, that is the very same proposition, we're going to have these failures. Okay. But we do not have, when I say failures, we do not have even reasonable lower bounds. Okay. Okay. Now, there's going to be an important distinction in this talk between the propositional and the quantificational case. So in the propositional case, we're just looking at propositional formulas and when various logical relations hold between them. In the quantificational case, we're looking at quantificational formulas, in particular formulas of first-order logic. Okay. What I want to say is there's perhaps some partial success when it comes to the propositional case. So the propositional case is not a miserable failure. Okay. The quantificational case is a miserable failure, subject to a caveat. That is, if you understand the notion of exact equivalence via the instantial semantics, the standard instantial semantics. What do I mean by the instantial semantics? It's roughly the idea that the universal statement simply be treated from a semantical point of view as the conjunction of its instances. And likewise, you treat an existential statement as the disjunction of its instances. Okay. That's the standard semantical treatment of conjunction and of universal quantified statements, universal and existentially quantified statements not only in truthmaker semantics, but in classical semantics, and indeed in most semantics for the quantifiers. Okay. What I want to say is, if we adopt that approach within the truthmaker tradition, we're going to have this miserable failure. The notion of exact equivalence or analytic implication is going to be a miserable. It's not going to be right. It's going to be absolute miserable failure in terms of doing what we want it to be able to do. Okay. Now that was the bad news, and the good news is that all of this failure in the quantification case arises, in my opinion, from adopting an instantial semantics. And my hope is that by adopting a generic semantics, we can overcome these difficulties. So rather than treating a universal statement, for example, that everything fires as equivalent, semantically equivalent to the conjunction of its instances, we treat it, in effect, as a statement about an arbitrary object. If I say everything fires, I'm saying the arbitrary object, the arbitrary thing, individual, whatever it, if you're talking about, if we're quantifying other people, the arbitrary person, we're saying the arbitrary person fires. So we take this in understanding the universal quantifier and also the existential quantifier, we take this detour through these generic objects. Okay. And then what that means within the truthmaker semantics is that it's facts, not about the individuals, the ordinary individuals, but about these generic individuals that will be the truth makers for the proposition. Once we adopt this approach, at least the difficulties that I'm going to pinpoint with the instantial approach disappear. As I say, I'm not exactly sure what form a generic semantics should take, but I'll make some brief remarks right at the end of this talk about the generic semantics. Okay, so you at least have a feel, not only for what it is, but for how it might be able to avoid the difficulties that I'm going to raise. Okay, so I'm saying all that by way of general introduction. I need to go through a little bit of background, and maybe I don't need to go through it in any great detail. I mean, we're all familiar with the idea of a state space, a model that's based upon the state space, and so on and so forth. There are different varieties of truthmaker semantics, depending upon what closure conditions you want to insist upon the set of truth makers or the set of falsity makers for a statement. Okay. I'm always going to have insist upon the non-vacuity condition. That is, that there be, for every statement in the language, there be at least one truth maker and at least one falsity maker. I actually haven't even thought about whether these results will still hold if we drop that condition. But anyway, I'm just going to take that condition for granted. Another condition this is a closure condition. There's nothing to do with the logical closure. This is the closure condition on the truth makers or falsity makers of a statement. Another condition you might want to insist upon is that if we've got some truth makers, then any non-empty fusion of those truth makers should itself be a truth maker. Okay, that's the inclusivity condition. That's an inclusive semantics when you have that condition. And you need that condition. I think probably sometimes it's necessarily sufficient if you want A and A to be equivalent to A. Okay. Now, I think insofar as you have these motivations I mentioned before, getting at a reasonable notion of analytic implication or setting a reasonable lower bound for logical closure, it's very reasonable to have an inclusive semantics. As I say, what it essentially gives you is that A and A is equivalent to A. And it's a brave soul who says the inference from A to A and A or vice versa isn't safe. A very brave soul. So anyway, within the present context, that would seem like part of a reasonable lower bound for non-closure, a closure condition for knowledge. Okay. There is a third condition you might add, which is convexivity, which is that if you've got two truth makers, one part of the other, then anything in between is also a truth maker. Okay. When you have that condition, then you get a semantics for angels or angle system. I always like to call him Angel because I think, but the correct pronunciation is Angle, I think. But I persist in calling him Angel. Okay, he's had an angelic role, so to speak, in the development of the subject. In fact, I was in correspondence with his son actually, and I mentioned to him that that he'd had this very prominent role. He was very pleased to hear that, okay, because he was somewhat neglected in his time. So he is a kind of angel hovering over us. Okay. I can say more about him, but anyway, let me not digress. Some of my remarks will pertain simply to the angelic system and this idea we have convexity as well. But most of my remarks will not involve that system. So that has to do with these closure conditions. You're all familiar now with the standard clauses for the propositional case. And I'll just say this rather than write it down. Let me briefly mention how the clauses should go in the case of quantification. Of course, in this case, we need to have an enriched notion of a model. We need to say if we have a predicate, let's say two-place predicate, we have a domain of individuals. Okay, now let me mention here, I'm going to assume a constant domain of individuals. I suspect that everything I say will apply when we have a variable domain, but just for simplicity, I'm going to assume in the semantics we have a constant domain of individuals. Now, we have this domain. So for every predicate, let's say two-place predicate, and any two individuals, we want to say what the truth makers and the false makers are. That is what makes it true that those individuals stand, that the predicate is, make it true that make the predicate true of the individuals and make it false that the predicate is true of the individuals. Okay. And then we give the standard clauses. And as I say, when it comes to a universally quantified statement, we just treat it as the conjunction of its instances. So I say for all x, fx, that's going to be equivalent to fi, where I names one of the individuals, and fj, blah, 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 blah. So if you work, that's in general going to be an infinitary conjunction, because there may be infinitely many objects in the domain. So when you work that out, you say, well, it's a conjunction. So I take a truth maker for the first conjunct, a truth maker with the second conjunct, and then I fuse them all, and I get a truth maker for the conjunction. Okay, so that's what a truth maker for the universal quantified statement will look like. Basically, we choose a truth maker for each instance, and then given that choice, we then fuse all those truth makers, and that will be a truth maker for the universally quantified statement. Okay, and similarly for the destructive case. And of course, in addition to that, once we've got the truth makers, we have to if we have these closure conditions on the truth makers, false makers, we have to close them. Let me point out one aspect, very important aspect about this definition, which is that it's second order. Okay, because what I actually say is, to get the truth maker, I say, look, has to be a choice function. I have to choose a truth maker for each instance. So it's actually a second order condition. This will be significant later. Okay. All right. As I say, that's actually a difference from. So if I were to formalize these truth conditions, I'd actually need a second order language to do it. So this is different from the usual Tarski definition, where I can formalize the whole truth definition in a first order language. That is, if I take the Tarski semantics for a first order language, it can itself be formalized in a first order language. Not so in the truth maker case. Okay. So all that's by way of just very general background. I hope that's reasonably clear. Okay. So what I want to do now is just to walk through this technical material that I have. So the technical material is in two parts, one dealing with the propositional case, the other dealing with the quantificational case. Each of those parts subdivides into two other parts, dealing with the case when we just have positive exact equivalence and the case when we have full exact equivalence. Okay, so there are four cases in all. Okay. And really, the propositional case is of interest in itself, but it's also a warm-up exercise for the quantificational case, which is more complicated. Okay. And in fact, in thinking about this matter, I started off with a propositional case. Okay. The actual statement of the results isn't so very different. The proofs are a lot more complicated in the quantificational case. And I'll say something. I'm not going to give to you any of the proofs, but they are far more complicated in the quantificational case. Okay. So we're dealing with the propositional case first. And if you recall Mark's talk, he was worried that, you know, we could trivialize this notion of analytic implication or of exact equivalence by stuffing unnecessary material, so to speak, on the statements that are in question. I just realized this morning that there's a technical distinction between stuffing and I said that what his stuffing is what I call swamping. There's actually a technical distinction between stuffing and swamping, which I would like to make use now. This here, what we have is stuffing, and I will later tell you what swamping is. Okay, but the two are connected. It's through stuffing that we swamp. Okay, but this will all become clear, I hope. Okay, so what we're going to do now is do stuffing a la Mark. Okay, the stuffing is a little more complicated than you might think. To get the results, we can't just thrust the stuffing into the turkey. We have to be very careful where we place it, and we actually need two kinds of stuffing, which go in two different places. Okay, so it's to get the desired results, we need to be very careful about how we stuff. Okay, so I'm imagining we have some sentence letters in our language, and now we're going to start stuffing. So what is the stuffing? Okay, what we stuff with are tautologies, things of the form P or not P, and contradictions. So the two kinds of stuffing. Everyone has their own taste. The dialethists, I guess, prefer P and not P, but the rest of us prefer P or not P, I guess. Anyway, two kinds of stuffing. And I call the one kind verum, and the other kind of falsum. So here's T, P, bold P is just these sentence letters. So this is all relative to a choice of sentence letters. Okay, so if you like, imagine that we have these a finite stock of sentence letters in the language, and overall, all our formulas make use of that stock of sentence letters. Okay. All right. So, and this is what I call unadorned verum and falsum constant, unadorned. So we don't add thyme or sage or anything like that to the stuffing. It's just straight stuffing. Bread. Okay. So the verum constant, unadorned, what I call unadorned verum constant, is simply the conjunction of the various instances of the log-studio middle. So we go through each of the sentence letters and we form the conjunction of the log-studio middle. P1 or not P1 and P2 or not P2. That's what we do. And similarly for the falsum constant, we take each instance of contradiction, P1 and not P1, and then we disjoin them all. That's what we do. So we have these two definitions of T and F. Okay. All right. Now we're going to stuff a formula. We've got some arbitrary formula A, and this is the A star is the stuffed version. We've actually now before I had this terminology of stuffing, I called this the embellishment. Okay. So we're just wrapping these things around the formula. So this new formula is T and A or F. So we don't just have T and A, we have T and A or F. So what I do is I disjoin A with a contradiction, and then I add this tautology. And these are straightforward contradictions and straightforward tautologies. They're as straightforward as they get, I guess, except for their length. Okay. All right. Now, we have the following theorem. Suppose that A and B are formulas of a propositional language in the sentence letters P1 to Pn. Then A and B are classical equivalents, that is, tautologically equivalent. If and only if A star P, A star and B star, that is, the stuffed or embellished versions of A and B, are exact equivalents. So this is a way in which we can reduce the notion of classical equivalence to exact equivalence. As long as we stuff A and B in this way, we can't tell using exact equivalence, classical equivalence apart. Of course, we can normally tell exact equivalence apart, P or not P. Classical equivalence. P or not P is a classical equivalent to Q or not Q. We can tell those apart, given Truthmaker semantics, stuff them, and we can no longer tell them apart. Someone who sees these formulas through their stuffed versions cannot distinguish between classical equivalents. All right. This notion of exact equivalence has to do with positive exact equivalence. So it means the things on the right just have the same positive content. It doesn't mean they have necessarily have the same negative content. And in fact, this theorem fails if on the right we have full exact equivalence. So this stuffing will not do if you want the notion of exact equivalence to be full. Okay, all right, I'll come back to that point. So we have to ask ourselves, is there a version of this theorem that will work when we insist not simply on positive exact equivalence, but on full exact equivalence? Okay. Yes. But some culinary expertise is required. So if we could go up. Thank you. Okay, here, that's fine. Good. So this is what the stuffing looks like when we go to full equivalence. So I have to distinguish between now other kinds of verum and Folsom constants. I mean, these are, when I say constants, of course, they're abbreviations for more complicated formulas. So there's what I call the weak verum and the strong Folsom constants, and then there's the adorned verum and Folsom constants. This is when we're doing something to the stuffing to make it a bit more enticing. Okay, so what's the weak? That's TW here. What's the weak thing? This, before we conjoined the various instances of the excluded middle, now we disjoin them. We form the disjunction. This is a very weak form of the low excluded middle. I don't just say P or not P. Oh, gosh. No, I say P1 or not P1, or P2 or not P2, and so on. So I'm very cautious. Okay. So it's a considerable weakening of the low excluded middle. And similarly, for the Folsom here, this is a very strong, I don't just have a straight contradiction, P1 and not P1, and not P1. I go all the way. I say P1 and not P1, and P2 and not P2, and so on, through all the sentence letters of the language. So that's the strong Folsom constant. Okay. Now, I have these hybrid constants. So T prime says either T, which was the unadorned verum constant, or the strong Folsom constant. So I can join the standard verum constant with this strong, disjoin it with the strong Folsom constant, and dually with the hybrid or the adorned Folsom constant. I conjoin the standard Folsom constant with the weak verum constant. Okay, So those are the technical definitions of the adorned theorem of Folsom constants. So, all right. So now, if we use the adorned theorem of Folsom constants as they have been defined, we can prove the, Eric, if we go up, fine, thank you. Okay. Now we have the extended reduction theorem. This is A and B are classical equivalents if and only if A prime. These are now the adorned embellishments of using these more complicated definitions of the constant are full exact equivalents. Okay. So as long as you're willing to sort of play around with what it is you, as I say, spice up the stuffing, then you're in good shape. You can extend the result in the way that I've just described. Let me say a little bit about the proof. So I won't go into any of the details. The proofs really depend on two techniques, connected techniques. One is the reduction to disjunctive normal form. Each of these formulas has an exact equivalent, which is disjunctive normal form. The other technique has to do with what you might call a canonical or literal model, where this is a model that's constructed actually from the language itself. So the truthmaker for P, a sentence letter P will be P itself, or strictly speaking, singleton P. The falsity maker will be the negation of P, or strictly speaking, the singleton of negation P. States are sets of literals. The partial ordering is just set theoretic inclusion. Okay, and then that gives you a model, and the way the model works is closely related to the way the normal forms work as well. Okay, and it's by looking at those two things and the way they're related, and what happens with the embellished formulas and so on and so forth, that you can then establish these results. Okay. All right. Now, turned out, this is a very pleasant surprise, there was a problem that puzzled me, which automatically got solved once I realized that the unextended result didn't apply to the case of full exact equivalence. So let me, this may be related to something that Johannes is going to be saying. Johannes is going to be saying. Under the inclusive semantics, where we don't have convexity, you can have two formulas that have the same, that are equivalent, exact equivalents, okay, in this logical sense, but even though the negations are not. The standard example is just the law of distribution. How am I doing for time? How much more time do I have? 3 minutes?
30.
30. Oh, my God. Okay, good. 30. Okay, good. All right. So these are exact equivalents. That is, they have the same truth makers. Okay. But when you look at the negations, they don't have the same. And looking at the negations is, in effect, to look at the corresponding lower distribution. Look to that one. So in effect, the question of whether these have the same falsity makers is the same as the question as whether these have the same truth makers. Oh yeah, so here we have a truth maker for this and a truth maker for that, and it's inclusive semantics, so we can fuse any truth maker for this with a truth maker for that. But look here, we can have a truth maker for for this, which is a truth maker for P, and a truth maker for this was a truth maker for R. And we can fuse then together a truth maker for P and a truth maker for R. And there's no reason in general to think that that truth maker will be a truth maker for this thing. Okay. So even though these two have the same positive content, these don't. And I was thought, look, surely you need 3 sentence letters to establish this result. Surely. And so I tried to prove that that when you had 2 sentence letters, a result of this sort wouldn't hold. And I failed. Okay. What I realized is that this can happen even with 2 sentence letters. Okay. And it was by thinking about these constants that I realized this. And I think the example that's under, here's the example. Okay. It's this thing here and that thing there. So only 2 sentence letters. Here we have, actually, this is the unadorned Verum constant with 2 sentence letters, P or not P and Q or not Q. And here what I do, you can see that I'm actually, you realize this is now the adorned version of it. This is what we had before, and I disjoin it now with the strong Folsom constant. Okay. They have the same truth makers, but they differ in their falsity makers. So, and that's actually very important for the proof to go through. Okay. So there actually is. Now, I felt very proud of myself for coming up with this example with 2 sentence letters, but probably Z3 can just take care of this in 0.003 seconds. I don't know. Anyway, it's a challenge for Z3. How long does it take Z3 to come up with this counterexample? I guess if it can do it, if it takes more than a second, I'll be pleased. All right. So that is that's the propositional case. Now I want to move to the quantificational case. Let me just have a sip of water here. Now we can prove analogous results in the quantificational case. Okay. And what we need to do is to give quantificational versions of the Verum and Folsom constants. The way it will go. Okay. So this is fairly straightforward to actually state what they are. So given a predicate F, let's say an n-place predicate F. Oh, as before, I imagine we have a fixed language. We have some predicates, each of a certain degree. So each takes a finite number of arguments. And we're always dealing with it within this language and looking at formulas within this language. And then I can have this formula that says F conforms to the log-excluding middle. So it's an n-place, F is an n-place predicate, it simply says for all x1 to xn, either F of x1 to xn, or it's not the case. Okay, F of x1. So that's just a quantificational version of what we had before, if we could move up. And then we have a weak excluding middle. So we're going to be very cautious here, as before. We're not going to say, for whatever x1 to xn might be, the log-excluding middle holds. We're going to say there are some individuals for which the log-excluding middle holds when it comes to the predicate F. So that's the weak version of the log-excluding middle. That corresponds to the weak Verum constant. Now we have F. This says that F's contradictory. And what this says is that there are individuals such that we both have F of those individuals and not F of those individuals. So that's just a standard contradiction. And then we have a strong contradiction. We say, for any individuals, whatever, this is the dialethes gone mad. Okay. For any individuals, whatever, every sentence is both true and false. Okay, whatever. Okay, not just this sentence or that sentence, every sentence. Okay. So that's a strong contradiction. That's the dialethes gone mad. Okay. All right. And now we can define, as before, the unadorned Verum of Folsom constants. So the unadorned Verum constants just says that the law excluded middle holds for each predicate in our language. Okay. And the unadorned Folsom constant says that we have there's a contradiction for one of the predicates of a language. And that just means that there are going to be some individuals for which a contradiction holds. Okay, all right. Now we have an analogous result. So we imagine now it's a quantification formula in these predicates, that is, it's in this language. Now we define, now I have what's called an F embellishment, which is just as before. We, first of all, we disjoin A with the Folsom constant, and then conjoin it, the result, with the Verum constant. But now, of course, the definition of these constants is different. They're quantificational formulas, either universal or existential formulas. Okay. And now we have a similar result that says A and B are classical equivalents if and only if A star and B star are exact equivalents. That is under the instantial semantics, Now, I haven't actually written down the proof of this, but it's, I'm pretty sure it works. It's actually it's a similar proof. That is, we use disjunctive normal forms and the canonical model. But the disjunctive normal form, we now have to go to infinitary language. Because we're treating, in the instantial semantics, we're treating universal quantifier as a conjunction of the instances. And in general, there can be infinitely many instances because the domain might be infinite. Okay. So basically, we write every quantificational formula as a propositional formula. And as I say, when the domain is infinite, that means that propositional formula is infinite. So we're actually dealing with an infinitary version of the calculus we had before. And so the whole thing has to be done within the context of an infinitary language. All right. Now this result only holds. I mean, in fact, this result includes the previous result as a special case, so it's evident. This result only holds when we're talking about weak exact equivalence on the right-hand side. Okay. So if we want now, if we want now to get an extended result that holds for full exact equivalence. No, can we go back? Thank you. We now need to define what I call the fancy embellishment, which is as before. So remember, what we can do is define T prime, which is up there, which is the disjunction of the standard Verum constant in this case with the strong Folsom constant, and dually with the when it comes to the Folsom constant. Okay. So we now have these adorned Verum and Folsom constants, and we do the same thing as before to describe what the fancy F embellishment is. And then once we do that, we can get this result where A and B are classical equivalents if and only if A prime and B prime are full exact equivalents. Okay. This is just a quantification analog of the previous result. Okay. All right. So, thank you. Let me just make some, thank you. I want to make, this is something that had puzzled me, and I was able to make a little bit of progress. What is the complexity, I mean in the computational sense, of exact equivalence when we go to the quantificational case? The complexity of exact equivalence in the propositional case is probably as low as it can get. if you got two formulas and you want to know whether they're exact equivalent, just look at the disjunctive normal forms and compare them. You can even do that on a piece of paper, even when the formulas are very long. Okay. So the notion of exact equivalence in the propositional case is a very low complexity. Nothing exponential time or space-wise about it. But what about the quantificational case? Okay. What this result shows is the complexity of exact equivalence in the quantificational case is at least as great as the complexity of classical equivalence in the quantificational case. Because here we have a very simple reduction. The reduction involves nothing very fancy at all. I have a very simple reduction of classical equivalence to exact equivalence. If I want to know whether two formulas are classical equivalent, all I have to do is embellish them and ask whether the embellishment's exactly equivalent. And the question gets solved. Okay. So this result shows that exact equivalence is at least as complex as again in the computational sense as classical equivalence. Is it of greater complexity? Is there a reduction in the other direction? Well, what I realized is that in the case of Angel's system, the two are of the same complexity. Now, this is not a straightforward result. And that is because the obvious thing to do is I've asked myself, is A an exact equivalent of B? And so, well, the obvious thing to do is to reduce that to a question about whether A sharp is classical equivalent to B sharp. Okay, so somehow I have to reduce this to a question about the equivalence, classical equivalence of two formulas. Okay. So the obvious way to do this is the following, is to formalize the semantics within the first order theory. I have a first order theory T, formalize the truth clauses and so on. Okay. And now I ask, T is meant to be a first order theory, finitely many axioms, and then you ask, well, I can now you like to be able to say there's a first order formula, A prime, which has S as a parameter. So, okay. I ask whether these are exact equivalents. So the obvious thing to do is to formalize the semantics. And now we have these formulas. I'm going to call, of course, I've used I'll call sharp here. These are formulas. These are meant to be first order formulas that say whether S makes A true. Okay. Okay. And now, instead of asking this, I ask whether this theory, the semantic theory, actually classically implies, if this is I'm assuming this is has finitely many axioms, classically implies something of this sort. I mean, for all S. Because this formula says, in effect, that A and B have the same truth makers. And similarly, if I wanted to include the falsity makers. Those of you who know about modal logic know that you can do something similar there, that you can find a corresponding first order version of the semantics, okay, and of the meaning of each formula within the semantics. Okay, that's the obvious thing to do. That's the obvious way to reduce this question about exact equivalence to a question about classical equivalence or classical validity. Okay, doesn't work for two reasons. One is that theory, T, is second order. Recall that in the theory, within the semantics, we say that the partial order has to be complete. That is, that every set of states has a least upper bound. The notion of being a least upper bound is first order, it's elementary. But now we're saying every set of states has the least upper bound. That's a second order formula. So that theory is not a first-order theory, at least if you formalize the semantics in this way. When it comes to the quantificational case, nor are these first order, because as I pointed out, the clause for the universal quantifier is second order. For there to be a truth maker, for S to be a truth maker for a quantified formula, we have to take a choice function. S has to come from a choice function. So we're quantifying over choice functions. Okay. I believe in the context of angel system, both these difficulties can be removed. This theory T can be replaced by a schematic version, that we don't actually need the full first order form. We never really needed to say every set has a least upper bound. It just need to be able to say the sets of interest to us have a least upper bound. With angel system as well, the second order clause can be reduced to a first order clause. Okay. I've just thought about this in the shower, so it probably doesn't work, but I feel fairly confident. Okay. And I doubt that Z3 could help here. But anyway, maybe Lean could. I don't know. All right. So if I'm right here, then the complexity of angels, of exact equivalence under angel system is just the same as the complexity of classical equivalence. Okay. Now, what this has to do with angel system. What if we just have the inclusive semantics without convexity? Or what if we don't even have the inclusive semantics? I then do not have an answer. So these are still open questions as far as I'm concerned. And I think they're very, very interesting questions. We should have answers. We should have answers to them. How am I doing for time? Really? Oh, gosh.
Oh, wait, no, 20 minutes.
20 minutes. Okay, good. That's excellent. All right. So what I want to go on to discuss now are the philosophical implications of some of these results. And then if there's time, to explain how a generic semantics might enable us to avoid some of the philosophical difficulties. I think maybe I can just erase this. Okay. So what I want to do is to come up with a scorecard. Okay. So there are 3 questions. This question of failure of closure for conceptual reasons. That is not because of any limitations in our inferential abilities, but because of the concept of knowledge. The concept of knowledge is just such that even though one thing classically follows from something else, knowing the one doesn't mean you know the other. Okay. So that's one issue. Another issue is failure of closure for inferential reasons. That is because of our limitations in our inferential abilities. A third thing is getting an analysis of analytic implication. Maybe I should say a little bit more about this very last thing. So people put this notion of analytic implication to use, let's say here, and they put it to other uses. I also think there's an intuitive notion of analytic implication. There's an intuitive notion of one proposition being part. One proposition being part of the content, or part of another proposition, or the content of one statement being part of the content of another statement. And I think that intuitive notion goes back to Kant's definition of analytic truth. He was thinking of subject-predicate statements primarily, and his idea was that the predicate or the concept of the predicate is included in the subject or the concept of the subject. Okay. Of course, that's a very restrictive notion. There was an unfortunate turn in the history of philosophical logic when Frege said, well, what Kant should have said is this. Okay. Frege got it completely wrong. Okay. Because his notion of analytic truth was not in any way like Kant's. Okay. The idea behind Kant's notion is that let's do in terms of having an analytic implication, is that you can tell through analysis of the contents of A and B whether B follows from A. All that's required is breaking down the content. And once you break down the content, you can then see whether the content of one is part of the other. And that's why it was thought by Kant to be a relatively trivial thing. All you need to do is take something apart. You don't need to put things together. All you need to do is take them apart. And that's epistemically, that's a trivial thing. Okay. That strikes me as the heart of the notion of analytic truth and analytic entailment. Okay. So there is, so this is still very vague. Analysis, taking things apart, blah, blah, blah. What does that all mean? Still, it's something to get, it gives you a grip, some kind of grip on the notion. Okay. So there's a question then as to, insofar as we have an intuitive grip on the notion, whether we're doing justice to the notion in these semantical accounts of analytic implication. Okay. Something I perhaps didn't sufficiently emphasize is a special case of analytic implication is exact equivalence. When we have exact equivalence, we have the very same proposition. So that is surely a case of analytic implication. I'm only going to be relying on that degenerate case. Okay. You might think, well, how exactly do I define analytic implication in terms of exact equivalence to get the more general notion? I'm not even going to be bothered with that question. Okay. I'm just saying, at the very least, we want exact equivalence to be a special case of analytic implication. All right. So what I want to do is to discuss how well our account of exact equivalence does in the propositional case and in the quantification case. So there are 6 questions. This is the scorecard. Okay. So let's deal first with the case, which is what Mark was mainly interested in, which is when there's a failure of knowledge to be closed under logical consequence, not because of our inferential limitations, but it has something to do with the concept of knowledge itself. Okay. And standard example, which is, you know, I have hands. I'm not a brain in the vat, so use that B for brain in the vat. And I know that it's not the case that I have hands. Not the case I have hands. Brain in the vat. So these are 2 things you might well think that I know that I have hands, and I know that I'm not, that I have, I know it's not the case that I have hands and a brain in the vat. Brains in the vat don't have hands. That's something I know. Okay. From this, it logically follows that I'm not a brain in the vat, but that's not something I know. I can go through the inferences. There's no problem my going through the inferences here. Okay. Still, those inferences do not preserve knowledge. That's the thought. Okay. So what we know from these previous results is that this H and this are equivalent to H. These two are classically equivalent. Sorry, I'm going to have to conjoin these actually. A little bit suspicious here, but I'm going to conjoin them. These two are classical equivalent, so I know their embellished versions are exactly equivalent. Wow. So if you think that exact equivalence is a reasonable lower bound here, there at least knowledge will be transmitted when it comes to exact equivalence. It looks as if we may face a problem because it may look as if these are exact equivalents. So this calls for more discussion, but let me just make a brief remark here about how the notion of exact equivalence may or may not be helping us. So again, this is something that Mark discussed. Suppose I have these two, I know these two things, and it's taken for granted I know these two things, that I have hands, and it's not the case that I have hands and I'm in a brain in the vat. Now I'm going to take you through a certain inference. I imagine that this person is going through this inference. Okay. And we have to ask ourselves, when do we fail to have knowledge? I'm taking for granted that at some point, we're going to end up with my not being a brain in the vat. I'm just taking for granted that that we don't, that my opponent, the skeptic, is right in thinking that we don't know this. Okay. So the idea is, first of all, we can first of all replace this by not H or not B. That's applying De Morgan. And these are actually equivalent, exact equivalents. Now I can conjoin them. And let me remark that Mark had this as an implication, and I wasn't sure why he didn't just deal with truth functional formulas. Anyway, I'm just dealing here with truth functional formulas. We have this. Now I distribute. This is contradiction. And now I can get, sorry, I've missed out this. H and not A, or, sorry, I missed out the negation there. And now I can get to this. Question now is, where did knowledge fail to be transmitted? Well, at least the proponent, there are many things you could say, but at least the proponent of exact equivalence, who thinks that exact equivalence provides a reasonable lower bound for knowledge closure, we can't question that step. There's a question as to whether we can conjoin. I take it that it's going to be an odd person who says, yeah, you know each of these things, but you don't know the conjunction. When you can put them two together, form a conjunction, you don't know them. Okay. This step here could indeed be challenged. This step can't really be challenged because this is a case of analytic implication. This is the paradigm case. And so really the only two cases that might reasonably be questioned are those two. That is, the question is, when does knowledge fail to be transmitted? To my mind, the most plausible thing to say here is that it's this step here that should be questioned. If you believe it, if you think I don't really know this, then the question is, where do I stop knowing? Here, I don't know, but I'm not a brain in the vat. But I do know that a contradiction holds, or I have hands and I'm not a brain in the vat. For me, if I'm doubting that I know this, then I should doubt that I know this. So that means that the failure here, if I'm right, or at least it's plausible that the failure arises from this distribution law. Okay. So this has mixed implications for using the notion of exact equivalence as a lower bound. If the exact equivalence in question is just a positive notion, then it's useless because we should have the distributive law for the positive notion. If it's the full notion, we can, according to the full notion, say that this implication fails. So what we have is this. If we're just using the positive notion, it's not going to help us. If indeed this is the correct diagnosis of where we fail to know. If we're using the full notion, then the full notion is actually saying, no, you can't necessarily make this inference, okay, because we don't have full exact equivalence, okay. And so I actually think that as long as we use the full notion, we can have some partial success here in explaining why we've got out of bounds, so to speak. We've gone beyond what we can safely do. Okay, well, as a matter of, okay. With the, actually, let me just do this side. 5 minutes? Okay. Here, I don't know what to say. Here's a very simple thing to say, which is this. This is the question of whether closure may fail because of our inferential limitations. And what we actually have as a result is that we can reproduce classical reasoning, propositional reasoning, as long as we embellish the formulas. Okay. Is that bad? Well, one reason it may not be bad is you might think that the question of our inferential limitations doesn't really even arise in the propositional case. It's just truth tables. So if we're interested in our inferential limitations, they don't really impede us when it comes to deducing one propositional formula from another. Okay. So we still have a reasonable lower bound. So that's something you could say here. Okay. When it comes to the analysis of analytic implication, I think this is a real success story. And part of the reason is this, that you can see through the reduction to normal forms that we do indeed know that these implications hold through analysis. If I've got two formulas A and B, and I want to know whether the content of one is part of the content of the other, what I can do is reduce them, and this is just a matter of analysis, so to speak, reduce them to disjunctive normal forms. So I have a disjunctive normal form of A. And then by looking at these disjunctive normal forms, I can just see, it's just a matter of path. I actually just have to examine the question of whether each disjunct there is part of a disjunct over there. I really can see through analysis, something like Kant's sense, that this implication holds. Okay. So we have the semantic analysis corresponds to proof theoretic analysis, which really does vindicate Kant's, the intuitive idea behind Kant's notion of analytic truth. Okay. What about the quantification side? When we adopt the instantial semantics, that's an important quantification. It's a hopeless failure on all counts. Okay, so, and that's basically because we can reproduce all classical reasoning we can mirror it, all classical entailments or equivalences by embellishing the formulas. Okay. Why don't I just focus on this case here? If I'm wondering whether B follows from A or B is classically equivalent to A, that surely is not a case, if we respect Kant's intuition, that we can know to be truth simply through analysis. The notion isn't even recursive. There's not even a decision procedure. And you might well think it's plausible. If we can know something through analysis, there should be a decision procedure. But then what it is to analyze can't be so complicated that it's not susceptible to an algorithm. Okay. But what we know is the complexity of this notion of exact equivalence is the same as that of classical logic. So the idea that we could know that these things hold through analysis is as implausible as it is in the case of classical logic. This cannot be a reasonable notion of exact equivalence insofar as it's meant to give us a notion of analytic implication. And the idea, if someone was thinking, look, don't think that any classical consequence is analytically contained. And then, okay, so there's an example. And let's suppose that we got A and we got B, and B is very remote. It's some remote consequence of A. No one can, in any intuitive sense, see B in A. And I just add these little embellishments, trivial embellishments. Oh, now I see that B is in A. It's nonsense. It's just simply nonsense. The idea that simply embellishing a formula in this way would enable you to now see the content of A, B as part of the content of A. And this is also vindicated by the proof procedure. How might we give an analytic proof procedure for determining whether B is an analytic part of A in the quantification context? You have to go infinitary. You have to look at infinitary formulas to do the same thing as we did over here. That's not analysis. When we have to go to look at infinitary, maybe it's analysis for angels. No, okay, all right. I'm probably very close to, yeah, okay. So you can actually see here that because we can basically mirror classical equivalence, we're going to have miserable failures here. If someone was really worried about our knowledge being closed, because of our inferential limitations, knowledge being closed under classical consequence, they should be equally worried when I embellish the formulas in the way that I've suggested. That insofar as you're really worried as to whether or not, if I know A, then I know B, because of my cognitive limitations and B is so remote from A, embellishing A and B in these trivial ways shouldn't then your intuition, insofar as you thought that inferential limitations stood in your way in the one case, clearly they still stand in the way in the other case, because the way of getting from A to A prime or from B to B prime is just logically trivial, just involves a couple of steps. Okay, so there's no real. You're not actually because of cognitive limitations, you're thinking, okay, I can't get from A to B. Now, I can get to A to B prime. These arguments here are just elementary. They just involve a few steps. You're just destroying contradictions or conjoining tautologies. So it's not as if I'm putting it's not as if my agent has to go through some awful, it's like capacities are not being in any way limited. There's just a few trivial steps here to do this, okay? Okay, so, and I don't have time to talk about the solution to these problems on the right. But what I'm suggesting is we need a different semantics here. Okay. And I'm suggesting that generic semantics, which I've just briefly mentioned at the beginning, is one for which these problems will disappear. The basic problem arises from thinking of the universal and existential statements in instantial terms, rather as it were. Well, there are various ways of going non-instantial. One particular way is to go generic, and so I'm thinking that if we go generic, then we can end up with more reasonable notions of exact equivalence and of analytic containment. Thank you.